Days away from one of the most consequential elections in U.S. history, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are neck and neck in the polls. Some on the left are saying that they won't back Harris, accusing her of complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza. So how will progressives vote? That conversation's coming up. But first, as Trump ratchets up his authoritarian and incendiary rhetoric, his critics say he would bring fascism to the White House. So would a Trump win be a genuine threat to U.S. democracy? I'll ask Trump's former acting chief of staff, this week's headliner, Mick Mulvaney. Mick Mulvaney, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
The election in the United States is just days away, and you're backing former President Donald Trump. Now, this is a man who has been convicted of 34 counts of corporate fraud, been found liable for sexual abuse. He's talked about deploying the military to deal with the enemy within, a term he uses for his domestic political rivals. His rally at Madison Square Garden featured a slew of speakers who used racist rhetoric and called his opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris, the Antichrist. He's lied about migrants eating pets in Ohio. He's even called for the termination of the U.S. Constitution following his election loss the last time around. I see you laughing because there is a level of absurdity to this stuff. The list goes on and on. How do you square that? How do you justify voting for a candidate like that?
Oh, Mark, you make it sound so one-sided. No, thanks for having me. Look, you've raised a bunch of different questions. Let's deal with them in a couple of them in turn. Look, let's deal with the personality first. There's a lot of folks who don't like the man's style. I get it. I worked for him for 4 years. I understand why folks don't like his style. But for people who are more interested in substance over form, which is not your exact question, but we'll get to your question in a second, they like his policies. They just do. They thought that the country was better off during the first term of the Trump administration. Unemployment was low, there was no inflation, we didn't have this current war in Ukraine, et cetera. So for a lot of folks who don't follow it very closely, they're looking at it through their own perspective of their own household and saying, you know what, we were better off under Donald Trump. So I think he's doing well there. But I think you asked me a larger question, which is, why is a man with that track record still in the game? Why is he a roughly 50-50 chance to win the presidency during the election in the upcoming days? And the answer is you could poke a lot of holes in a lot of that. For some people, that's satisfactory. For other people, it's clearly not. In fact, for about half the country it is, and for half the country it's not.
You yourself said that Trump failed as a president on January 6th. You called it an attempted coup. You resigned from the administration. Then in 2023, you said he was whittling at his base because of his, quote, death and destruction stuff and having dinner with white supremacists. You, of course, were referring to that Mar-a-Lago dinner he had with the Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes. I get saying some stuff happens in the past. But again, there's a character question here. And then there's the fact that he's cavorting with white supremacists and at least inciting, if not being directly responsible for, an attempted coup on the government. That seems to foreshadow more danger, more harm, more violence, more bad news for the country.
Keep in mind, what was my job as the chief of staff, the President of the United States? My job, I was the only person in the building that got paid to tell him the stuff that he didn't want to hear. I was supposed to be the one to say, Mr. President, this was good today, and this was bad today. By the way, I was really good at that job, and I've tried to maintain that after I left the administration. So when he does stuff that I think is stupid, like having dinner with a white supremacist, I have not hesitated at all to call that out. If he does something I think is good, I'll say it. If he does something I think it's bad, to say it. A lot of times people on the Trump team will only focus on the stuff that I said that's nice, and people on the Harris team will only focus on the stuff I say that's negative, but I try to shoot it down the middle. Your character question is a good one. And yes, character is an issue. I think he's going to pick some excellent people. I was worried about that in the beginning, Mark. Back a year and a half ago, I was worried about who might go work for him. But now in talking to folks who are interested in the cabinet positions, there's some really good names. You might recognize some of them. Mike Pompeo would go back in. I feel like Robert O'Brien would go back in. Stephen Mnuchin has talked about going back in. Robert Lighthizer, our trade representative. But go back to your character question for just a second. Look, it's important to me. It's one of the reasons I quit my job on January 6th. He didn't live up to my expectations as a boss. My expectations for the man
not just
I
as a
work
boss,
for,
because that could sound like,
No, no,
I mean, there's lots
no.
of bosses, but I mean, an attempted
No, no.
coup goes beyond not meeting my expectations as a boss.
No, stop. No, stop. Now you're putting words in my mouth. I never said I quit because of the attempted coup. I quit because he failed to live up to my expectations as the president, and he was my boss on that particular day. And as you know, sometimes
What was your
you go to work,
expectation? What was your expectation?
my expectation was that he respond much quicker. They did not take my phone calls during the day. I was trying to encourage him to go on television, to tell people to go home. I felt like he had the ability to send those people home, and I think that he acted too slowly. This is something that's unique to me as an employee. If your boss does something at work that you don't like, you can either be quiet and have people assume that you assent and agree with what that person is doing, or you can try to change things. And failing those two things, you can quit, which is what I did.
Mick, if Donald Trump loses, and there is another attempted coup, to use your language, do you have any reason to believe, should I have any reason to believe that Donald Trump will act any more responsibly or do anything to prevent it from happening?
Yeah, I get asked a lot about what the days after the election will hold, and I will admit to you the same lack of visibility, Mark, that I had in 2020. If you had asked me in 2020 if there would be an armed uprising to try and prevent the certification of the election of the president, I would say, no, that's not possible in this country. It's certainly
But let me
not
ask you about
possible.
something else. Donald Trump has called immigrants rapists. He has said that migrants have, quote, bad genes. He called Vice President Kamala Harris lazy as hell. He even questioned her identity as a black woman back in July, saying, I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black. Are you okay with a presidential candidate that uses that sort of rhetoric?
Am I okay with it? Would I use it? No. I was in elected office for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years. I would have been killed if I'd used language like that, and rightly so. Donald Trump has managed to get away with stuff in terms of his style that would end the career of any other politician. That being said, look, Donald Trump is not the only person in this country who talks like this. There's a reason he's doing better with lower educated white men. There's a reason he's doing better with manufacturing workers. There's a reason he's doing better with the blue collar folks in this country, because he talks a lot like they do sometimes. Are you telling me that Donald Trump is the only person in this country who's ever like that?
But you're answering the wrong question. You're saying what would happen. You're saying other people would do the same thing, or other people would use that language, or other people have used that language. I'm addressing the should question. Should we be electing somebody who's those? So we shouldn't be electing Donald Trump.
No. Should someone be using that language? My answer is no, they shouldn't.
Of
but
course,
he does.
we agree that no one should use it. But what you're saying is he's not the only person who says racist stuff. He's the only one running for president.
Come back to the issue, right? Which is, okay, you've got a guy who says that Kamala Harris, I didn't know she was black. Okay. I thought, by the way, I think his comment was, I thought she was Asian because she used to run as the first Asian senator, or whatever the deal was. I can't remember the exact context. Is that disqualifying? Does that mean, okay, you know what? I don't like that so much that I'm going to vote for the other person who wants to raise my taxes and open my borders and all the things that we're afraid the Democrats are going to do. Look, I get the fact that he's a flawed candidate. Most people are.
But I'm not worried about him saying he didn't know
choice.
somebody was black. But how about the bad genes from migrants and the immigrants being rapists? Those are tough to explain,
listen,
sir.
I have never liked that language. I didn't like the part.
Would you call it
back
racist?
in 2016 when he said they're coming across. I don't think it. Listen, if I thought the man was racist, I wouldn't work for him. I've worked with men and women of the minority community who adore working for Donald Trump.
We are more than a year into Israel's genocide in Gaza. During this time, we've seen some of the biggest student protests on college campuses in decades. This will be at the top of the agenda for whoever becomes president. Trump has made one of his 20 core campaign promises to deport, quote, pro-Hamas radicals and make college campuses, quote, patriotic again. What does that even mean? What does it mean to make college campuses patriotic?
I disagree with, by the way, just for the sake of the discussion, disagree with your description of what's happening as a genocide. We can talk about that. That's probably a longer conversation for another day, but it's a word you used. I don't use the word. I don't agree with that. I think that a lot of people are upset with what's happening on the college campuses, the anti-American attitude that's taking place on college campuses now. And I think he's tapped into something there. By the way, he's not the only one. My guess is a majority of Americans don't like to see it, maybe a narrow majority, but I think a majority of Americans would probably side with Israel on this as a defensive reaction to what happened on October 7th. It's a divisive issue that it cuts America nearly down the middle between being pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. I get that for sake of this discussion. But I don't think Donald Trump was out of line saying, look, I think that we should be allowed to have free speech on college campuses, but we shouldn't have anti-Semitism. You've seen some of the same videos I have of the way that some Jewish students have been treated on American college campuses.
But that's not what Donald Trump. We don't have to guess what Donald Trump's saying. I'll quote for you what Donald Trump says.
Right.
He says.
But I'm saying why he
says no. But what I'm saying is you're misrepresenting what he said. He's not saying just get rid of anti-Semitism. We all agree get rid of anti-Semitism. He doesn't want someone with radical politics to be on campus. He says get rid of them too. But let me ask you about something else. Donald Trump also said during his presidential debate with Joe Biden last July that the United States should let Israel go and quote, finish the job. What did he mean by that?
I have no idea. I've not asked him. My guess is they probably do whatever they think is necessary to ensure their safety. I don't find that particularly offensive. I'm surprised anybody else does. If you really believe that you were an existential threat, if you believed as a nation, as a family, as a business, whatever, that there was an existential threat, that someone wanted to kill you, what would the limitation be on what we would do to prevent that from happening?
International law.
Whoa, no.
If you're asking
you're questioning Israel, no, Mark, I haven't interrupted you all day. You're questioning Israel's right to exist, and that's wrong.
What do you mean?
You're saying that if someone really wants to exterminate Israel, there could be international law that would allow them to do that, and I absolutely
that's a wild misrepresentation of what I said. Your question to me was, if someone posed a threat to you, what would be the limitations on what you would do? And I would say...
the word I used was existential, an existential threat.
Existential threat. And my argument, or my response rather, was international law, meaning that I would have a right to defend myself, but within the bounds of the law, i.e., I can't indiscriminately kill civilians. I can't use disproportionate force. I can't bomb hospitals. Those are, just as examples, those are things that international law prevent us from doing, even in the defense of one's self. And now you somehow turn that into me saying Israel doesn't have a right to exist.
I have the right. Do I have the right to bomb hospitals if it's being used as a military facility? Under international law, I do. In fact, the people using that hospital as a military facility, as a shield, are committing violations of international law themselves.
The evidence shows that that's not the case. But beyond that, I guess the point here is the rest of the world, or much of the world, is calling for a ceasefire. They're calling for peace. And Donald Trump is saying Israel go in there and finish the job. This was in the context of talking about the death of tens of thousands. Now we're over to 40,000 officially, and probably many more people dead in Gaza, most of whom are not members of Hamas, most of whom are not carrying weapons.
Mark, I know this is you asking me questions. Let me ask you a question. Do you think it'd be different under a Harris administration?
No. I don't. Which is why I think they're both making an incredibly terrible set of decisions. Biden is leading this administration, and Harris is saying, I'm not going to do much different. But just because Harris is bad, and we've talked about that on this very show, just because Harris is bad doesn't mean Trump gets a pass here. Trump has to be subjected to the same scrutiny.
I think that's probably fair. I'm not familiar with the other work you've done on the station regarding the Harris policies, but I guess my point is this, is that both parties in this country seem to be pretty much on the same place in defending what Israel is doing.
Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Mark, I hope to chat again. Thanks very much.
With elections in the United States around the corner, many voters on the left are grappling with a familiar debate. Vote strategically or vote with your conscience, even if it risks splitting the progressive vote. As Washington continues to arm Israel amid its genocide in Gaza and assault on Lebanon, many say they won't vote for U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris and call to vote for a third party. Others say risking a second Trump presidency could cause irreparable harm domestically and would do nothing to rein in Israel's genocidal campaign. So, which way will progressives vote in this election? And could it determine the outcome of the race? Joining me to discuss this is Briahna Joy Gray, political commentator, host of the Bad Faith podcast, and former national press secretary for the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. And Danielle Moodie, host of the Danielle Moodie Show on YouTube, also co-host of the new Abnormal podcast. So good to see both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Briahna, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
You've been in favor of supporting third parties as a way of challenging the two-party system. And you believe, if I'm understanding you correctly, that progressives should just abandon the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think that this election in particular has really revealed why that's so necessary. Oftentimes progressives are told that the reason why the Democratic Party might not embrace a particular policy priority is because it's simply not popular, and that there's a trade-off between Democrats winning elections and getting the votes that are necessary to win elections and pursuing some progressive priority, which is framed by the Democrats as too esoteric to actually win if it's on the ballot. I think that's often not the case, but with respect to Gaza, polls are really, really clear that Kamala Harris would benefit enormously from supporting an arms embargo against Israel, particularly in the states that she really needs to win. I'm talking 30+% of voters in Georgia are saying that they would be more likely to vote for Kamala Harris if she were to support an arms embargo versus single-digit numbers who'd say they'd be less likely to vote for her. So I think the question that people have to ask themselves is, why is the Democratic Party more invested in sending arms to Israel as it commits a plausible genocide than they are in winning an election to defeat fascism? If the stakes are really that high, why are they preferring to prioritize the agenda of another country that's breaking international law over the will of their own electorate?
Now, Danielle, you have a different take on this. You are supporting Vice President Harris's run for office. You've supported Democrats for some time, despite having certain, I would say, significant disagreements with the party. Why is voting Democrat a better option in light of that?
We're facing an existential threat right now in Donald Trump and the MAGA Republican Party. There is, to me, there is no alternative place that would be viable to put my vote other than with the Democratic Party right now. There is no better way currently to help the people of Gaza as well as to help the people in this country without voting for Vice President Kamala Harris. I mean, what Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans have laid out just in Project 2025 for Black people, for people of color, for women, for queer people in this country is like nothing that we've ever seen in America. And they are ready on day one. So I can't think to myself, well, let me consider either withholding my vote or voting for a third party that would almost certainly confirm Donald Trump into a second term that, by the way, he may never leave. Right? Because he has said that he wants to be a dictator on day one, that he will protect, just recently, I'll protect women whether they want it or not, right? So they are laying out for us what their plans look like. And if we decide to divide our vote, then to me, that is a vote for Donald Trump. And I can't just sit by and watch our democracy fall completely into the hands of Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, because and I believe in the disagreements and I understand where they are coming from, but the stakes are just too high to ride it on a third party right now that we know is not viable.
Briahna, what do you say?
And I would argue that every 4 years we're told we have the most important election of our lifetime, the most existential threat we've ever had to our democracy, is precisely because we don't get a counterbalance from the Democratic Party in the form of any accountability for the Democratic Party. This is where lesser of two evilism brings you. This is where vote blue no matter who. I will vote for a Democrat no matter what because they're better than the Republicans bring you. At what point are the Democrats ever going to be pushed to the left, where frankly the majority of the electorate is on issues like a living wage, Medicare for all, not having this a military that constantly funds interventions all over the world, including obviously in Gaza? If you vote for them no matter what they do, no matter how often they campaign with Dick Cheney and throw progressives and their base under the bus, at what point are we going to stop letting Democrats convince us that they have to literally become Republicans in order to beat Republicans that are worse than the Republicans before? And at what point are we going to invest in building a new party system that actually is accountable to the will of the people?
There's an interesting take from many people on the left, including political activist Angela Davis, who obviously has been a longstanding opponent and critic of the Israeli occupation and now genocide, who argue that this is not about an individual articulation of our virtues or our values or our principles per se. It's a strategy. It's always a tactic. It's always a strategy. And she's saying this is about choosing your opponent. You know, you'd rather choose your opponent. You'd rather pick the person who you can have the most space to operate with. What do you say to that?
Well, for one, I would resist the framing that it's just a symbolic vote. I think that voting green is a strategic vote. For one, if you were in a deeply blue or deeply red state, voting for one of the two corporate parties is quite literally throwing your vote away. Instead, voting for a third party like the Green Party enables them to get to 5% of the vote. It enables them to have access to federal funds, enables them to run more candidates and have a more serious campaign if they could just get 5% of the vote in various states. Second of all, to the core of your point, I think that the nature, the gravity of the genocide and the response that we're seeing from the Democratic Party speaks volumes. People are arguing, particularly to Muslim and Arab Americans across the country who are so disgusted by the enormous death toll and humanitarian crisis that we've seen over the past year, that Trump is going to be worse in the face of a Democratic Party that has singularly, principally underwritten all of the horrors that we've seen coming out of Gaza. It is really rich to try to fearmonger about fascism coming from the other side of the aisle when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's administration is the administration responsible for funding this genocide, and without which this genocide could not have taken place.
So Danielle, to that point, I mean, Gaza is a tough argument to hang your hat on if you're a Democrat, but that seems to be what many supporters of Kamala Harris have certainly argued, right? If you think Gaza's bad now, wait until, Trump gets back in here. What do you make of that?
Here's the reality. We know that Donald Trump, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, want to bulldoze what is left of Gaza. We know that Jared Kushner sees Gaza as nothing more than beachfront property that he would like to capitalize on. Do I agree with what the Harris-Biden team have done over the last year plus? I absolutely do not. I think that it is atrocious, and I wish that they would stop sending funds to Israel. I wish that they would have and actively work for a ceasefire. I wish that Netanyahu hadn't been playing three-dimensional chess while apparently they were playing checkers. Like, I wish that that had not been the case. The reality here, though, is that we are between a rock and a very, very hard place. And I can't say that finding now, in this moment, when America, we have already lost Roe v. Wade, we have already lost affirmative action, we have already lost voting rights, we are seeing gerrymandering beyond things that we had ever seen before. We have the Supreme Court that just said to Virginia, go ahead with your 1,600 votes, keep throwing them in the trash, and that's totally okay. I cannot see not putting a vote that could absolutely put Donald Trump over the top or staying home on just one issue. It isn't just about one issue. It is about a multitude of issues that are affecting every aspect of our lives.
I mean, Briahna, that's an interesting.
It's every aspect.
I'd love to pick up on that. Democrats make choices, and if you want to cynically read into it, there's an argument that says they love to be able to dangle a carrot, specifically in the framework of the Supreme Court, in order to induce people to go to the polls, even though they're desperately unhappy, they're financially immiserated, and things get worse for them every year. And this is an important point, Marc, that I really want to get across. Yeah. If we had started mobilizing back in 2000 for an alternative party instead of demonizing someone like Ralph Nader, whose fault it wasn't that the election was lost, stolen, by the way, then maybe we wouldn't be in a place now where we feel like we are between this rock and a hard place. Maybe we would have a genuine, robust third-party option to invest in. But they haven't done that in the past, and we need to start doing it now. And the reason is because these two corporate parties will never deliver. The Democratic Party is one wing of this two-wing corporate bird. And its job is to create the veneer that someone in office is working for you, that this system is actually working. And if you just keep voting and get enough progressives into office, magically something's going to happen. But guess what? Nancy Pelosi was once AOC. The party changes you. You don't change the party. And there are really important structural financial reasons why that's the case.
Danielle, and I'll give you the last word on this. I think you would agree that at some point we have to break the two-party system.
Yes.
And I think you would agree that the Republican candidate keeps getting worse. So then, if the candidate keeps getting worse, but the system needs to get broken, when do we do it?
And I think that, and unfortunately, this is the place that we find ourselves. One, I don't think that we have a two-party system right now. I think that the Republican Party has abdicated their responsibility to the Constitution and to the United States 9 years ago when they elected Donald Trump. And I can tell you that, like, as a queer Black woman in America, like, I can't imagine not having had a Supreme Court, not having had past marriage equality, not having been identified as like a full human being inside of this country. And so when we look at the way that things have devolved so quickly over 9 years, yes, at some point, do I think that we need a multi-party system? Absolutely. But have things gotten to such an existential place that now, do I think now is the time for that? I really don't. Because I would like to never utter Donald Trump's name again. I would like MAGA to go the way into the wind.
Well, that has to be the last word. I want to thank both of you for being here. Briahna Joy Gray, Danielle Moodie, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Everybody, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back next week.